And my mum was, of course, a fan of Prisoner Cell Block H. And there was a character on that. They were having similar symptoms to what I was. And my mum sort of thought to herself, that's odd. That's very similar to what Johanna has. So they took bloods from me. They phoned my mum and dad that evening and said, it looks like there's something wrong with her kidneys.
Diary of a Kidney Warrior podcast in partnership with Kidney Care UK. Sharing faith, knowledge, hope, and love.
Hi and welcome to Diary of a Kidney Warrior podcast. I'm your host, Dee Moore. My guest today is Johanna. In this two-part episode, Johanna joins me to share her kidney warrior story, a lifelong journey shaped by chronic kidney disease, dialysis, and transplantation. In part 1, Johanna reflects on becoming seriously ill as a child, growing up with CKD, and trying to navigate school, friendships, and everyday life while facing the realities of kidney disease at such a young age. Here is part 1 of my conversation with Johanna. Before we begin, please remember that this podcast shares personal experiences and is not a substitute for professional medical advice. Always consult your healthcare team for guidance about your own health or treatment decisions. Today's episode contains discussions around medical complications. Please listen with care and be kind with yourself. Hi, and welcome to Diary of a Kidney Warrior podcast. How are you doing today, Johanna?
Yeah, hi Dee. I'm good today, thanks. Beautiful sunny day here in Glasgow, so can't complain.
Wonderful, wonderful. It's not too bad here as well, you know, it makes a difference. We all know how English weather can be, but today with the sun seems to be out, it's shining, it's bright. And
Good.
Welcome to the podcast. It is really, really nice to have you here. And everyone knows what I'm going to say, and they're going to go, oh, she's saying it again. But I say it every time. I love recording Kidney Warrior story interviews because why? There's so much that you can learn from someone's lived experience with CKD. Because why? We've worn the T-shirt. We've gone through the ups and downs of this journey. And so, yes, I love recording Kidney Warrior story interviews. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm excited.
Oh, I'm excited too. So I'm going to ask my first question. And my first question is, how did your Kidney Warrior story begin? And how were you diagnosed?
So my kidney warrior story started way back in 1990 when I was 3 years old. And I was diagnosed with, at the time I was diagnosed with glomerulonephritis. However, that turned out not to be the case. But yeah, it was a sort of process of me being quite unwell as a child. You know, the typical symptoms we get with CKD of headaches, nausea, edema, you know, you're getting puffy face, puffy round the stomach, retaining fluids. Mum and dad had taken me back and forth to the doctor. But back then, you know, I don't think, you know, anybody sort of thought, well, it's a child with kidney. They didn't suspect there was anything wrong with the kidneys. And my mum was, of course, a fan of Prisoner Cell Block H, like many people were back then. And there was a character on that. I don't know their name, so sorry. But they were having similar symptoms to what I was. And my mum sort of thought to herself, that's odd. That's very similar to what Johanna has. So I kept going back to the GP back and forth, and it was just, oh, it's a virus, or given an antibiotics, bacterial, whatever, we'll try this, we'll try that. Until obviously my mum pushed a bit further because of what she'd seen on Prisoner Cell Block H. So they took bloods from me, and my mum just knew that once they took these bloods, they were going to phone her that night. And sure enough, they phoned my mum and dad that evening and said, it looks like there's something wrong with her kidneys. You're going to need to take her to the Children's Hospital in Glasgow, York Hill, which they did. So went to York Hill, and as you know yourself, they'd done a biopsy, they'd done a renal biopsy to see what was going on. And of course, the results of that were that the kidneys were badly scarred, and they had diagnosed me with glomerulonephritis, thinking that it had came from potentially a strep infection or some kind of autoimmune reason. So of course they tried to treat it with intravenous steroids and all of the usual stuff, but that didn't have any effect.
I would have to say that this has to be a first on the podcast, that someone's diagnosis actually came from watching a TV program. I mean, that just goes to show how important even soaps can be in terms of raising awareness of chronic conditions such as kidney disease. And I remember Prisoner Cell Block H very well, actually. It was my mum's favorite program and we would watch it together. So yeah, it's amazing what can come from a fictional story, but it is so powerful and so important that these are presented by these programs accurately. So I'm really glad that, you know, a story had that powerful outcome of changing your life, really. And credit to your mom for actually pushing for that, because, you know, because maybe you would have had a much later diagnosis without your mom there. So kudos to your mom, and kudos to, I mean, I know the show doesn't run anymore, but you know, to those producers, if they happen to be listening, thank you for raising awareness.
Yeah.
So thumbs up to them.
Thumbs up to them, yeah.
So getting a diagnosis at such a young age, do you have any memories of this time, or any memories of how you felt at this time, or were you too young?
No, I do remember at all. I think because obviously it was so significant and it was so terrifying. Because obviously once, it was about 8 weeks later after the diagnosis that I ended up on dialysis. It was peritoneal dialysis initially, but I remember walking into the ward for the first time, the children's ward, and everything looked huge and the beds looked like they were up in the sky. And I remember they were watching The Singing Kettle, which really famous Scottish programme, on one of those TVs that you wheel in. Never used to get them in school. So I remember that. And of course, I remember getting my blood pressure taken for the first time, and I was screaming and terrified, didn't know what was happening. But obviously you're sort of thrown into it, and when you're getting tubes put in for dialysis, I had to get a nasal gastric tube put down because I was sick all the time, so I couldn't hold any food. So constantly I remember that really, really well. And then of course the little bits in between. So for example, if I had to get a new central line put in once I'd started hemodialysis, I didn't like plasters in the dressings, so they would have to hold me down and rip the plasters off and clean the betadine off, and it was just horrendous. I've still got a fear of plasters now. Like, I really don't like it. Or I'd wake up, there was a time that I woke up and they put a central line in kind of up in my neck here. And I woke up, my hair was all matted in blood, and my mum had spent like an hour washing the blood out my hair. There was a lot of things as a child because you understood, but you didn't understand why they had to do certain things. There was other, if your potassium was too high, they would have to give you Lokelma, but how they done it was, I won't really go into detail, but they had to put it down your back passage before you went. So there was other things, and everything was just horrendous. Everything was just terrifying. And I remember being in York Hill and I was too scared to go to sleep because I was convinced that if I went to sleep without my mum or dad there, they'd come and put a needle in me or do something to me without me knowing. So yeah, it really, you started to then just become so hyper vigilant as a child that you had to watch your back constantly. That there was always going to be something happening or something done, or it was, you didn't trust anybody. I didn't trust anybody, although they were lovely and they were really nice. It was really quite scary.
that is a lot for such a young child to have to process and come to terms with and understand. It was there anybody at that time that gave you any support in understanding what was happening to you, like a nurse or support worker that broke things down or explained anything?
So there was, most of the nurses were fantastic at York Hill. I mean, they were all wonderful, but there was one nurse specifically called Karen who, took took a wee shine to me, I guess you could say, and that she really took me under her wing. She was a super young nurse at the time, no children, no husband, and she would sit with me all the time and play games with me. If I was in the ward for a period of time, her and someone else would take me out, say to the Disney store or something, to distract me and keep my mind off of what was happening. She'd sit with a cold flannel on my head when I had headaches, and I just felt like, but when my mum or dad couldn't be there with me, Karen was like a second mum, essentially, that I felt safe with, and that really helped me massively through really difficult surgeries and multiple line changes and multiple issues with dialysis and all of the things that come with having CKD.
It's really nice to hear that you had that support from Karen. And so shout out to Karen for the
Yeah.
support that she gave you through those times. So you described being on peritoneal dialysis and then having to switch to a line for hemodialysis. So how long were you on peritoneal dialysis before you had to switch over?
So I was on peritoneal dialysis for around 1 year, which I'd done at home. So back in this was probably 1991 by this point. The machines were huge. I mean, they were massive. So they took up your whole bedroom. Um, so my mum and dad were trained to do that. And then you would have two nurses that would come out and check your line. So back then, I think that the lines have changed now, but they were a big sort of tube that you had in your abdomen. And then I ended up getting peritonitis when I was about 5, I think. So of course they had to remove the PD line and put me on hemodialysis after that. Um, and yeah, the lines back then were pretty much the same as the ones we have now for the central lines for dialysis. But of course, as a child, you would get put under general anaesthetic to get those put in because you wouldn't be able to tolerate it. But again, they were always quite problematic, the lines for hemodialysis. So there'd be times where maybe you would come back from theatre and they'd have to try the line as they do now still, and it wouldn't be working. So there was a specific time I remember that I was sitting on the bed and one of the consultants was moving the line around to try and like, manipulate it within my skin. And I was screaming, screaming, please stop, please stop, please stop. And my dad, who's sadly passed away now, he said he was standing at the other side of the bed and he just wanted to come and drag the doctor off me. But he knew that he was doing it for the right reasons. So hemodialysis and getting the lines was just, hemo was really difficult as a child. The machines were a lot more primitive, so they weren't as high tech as they are now. So I struggled quite a lot in hemodialysis. It was quite a difficult time.
So you started at home with peritoneal dialysis. When you started hemo, I know that would start in center. Did they give you the opportunity to do hemo at home, or was it always in center?
I don't think at that time for children it was an option. So it was in centre. So at York Hill, they done it was essentially a porta cabin. So it was the porta cabin was it also had a clinic in it, and before Ronald McDonald House, that was where the parents could also go and stay. But they had this bit up the stairs where it was sort of like maybe 6 dialysis machines, so 6 of us at a time. And it it was just the same people, like yeah, it is now. The same shift, the same kids, and the same thing all the time. And your mum and dad could stay with you, obviously, because you were a child. And, there was a play leader that would sometimes come in and do art with you while you were on the machine. Or you would just sit and watch Disney movies. We had loads of, drawers full of videotapes of Disney movies. Fern Gully was a favourite, I remember. So that was sort of on all the time. So can't really watch Fern Gully anymore. But it was it was always, as much as it was difficult at the porta cabins doing chemo, and chemo itself was difficult as a child, the atmosphere was really caring and loving, and you felt that was, you felt safe there as well.
So, for anyone listening or watching today who's the parent of a child that's just been diagnosed with CKD, what advice do you have for them?
I guess all stages are different. But if the child was to go on and develop kidney failure and need dialysis, they are going to have a turbulent time ahead. There's no doubt about that. But the majority of the times in the paediatric hospitals, the staff are so fantastic that not only the family, but the child is well supported. And things now are much better. There's more charities that will help support the families and distract the children by, playing video games with them or doing schooling with them. That's a big thing as well. So a lot of kids don't fall behind in school. But also, I think that despite how challenging it'll be, that it doesn't mean that it's the end of the road for their child. It doesn't mean that they can't go on in the future, despite their illness, to go on and have a fulfilling life. And their challenges can only benefit them sometimes, because they'll have experiences that their peers have not had, and they'll see things in such a different way that it's actually going to build them and build their character and make them far more resilient than perhaps Joe Blogs walking in the street. And that, I can only speak from my experience that it's not been easy to get to where I am today. But, I've managed to become a mother. I have been able to have a child, despite that never having seemed possible. I'm married, and I've got a career, which again I never thought possible. So anything is possible for these children with the right support, and parents do need to know that, because I can only imagine as a mother how horrendous it is to have that diagnosis for your child.
So, I know that you went on to have a kidney transplant. So, how did that come about?
So my first kidney transplant was in 1995 when I was 7. I had been on the list for about 4 years at that point. And I was on dialysis, and we got the call whilst I was in the unit having dialysis that a kidney had become available. I was really annoyed because my favourite meal had come up from the canteen and I wasn't allowed to eat it. So I had to be nil by mouth. So I was a bit annoyed about that. But anyway, I got that kidney that night, and it didn't work initially. Took a little bit of time to kick in. Still had to get dialysis for a good week or so before the kidney started functioning properly. I'm not sure who it came from. I'm not sure where it came from. I know that it was from another child that had obviously sadly passed. And that was definitely something I always kept with me for as long as I had that transplant.
What difference did that kidney transplant make to your life?
Made a huge difference. I mean, the first thing I can remember is that I was feeling great for the first time in a long time, and the world had opened up in terms of diet. So obviously I had had this nasal gastric tube for the majority of being on dialysis, and then I had moved to having a gastrostomy feeding tube. So I was always fed through a bag of some sort. Have the transplant. First thing I ask to eat when I'm feeling better is a banana. And then I wanted a Twix, and I wanted everything, and I was just a bottomless pit. I just wanted to eat and eat. So I no longer needed the gastrostomy tube or the nasal gastric tube. Um, and it was just so freeing, and it was the sickness and everything had gone. So I no longer needed those things. And of course, I was able to then continue on just normally at school, primary school, through high school, despite obviously little issues in between, the certain things that being immunosuppressed can bring. But I had a relatively normal childhood and teenage years, and I was able to do all the same things that my peers were able to do without restriction and without having tubes all over the place. And yeah, I was really fortunate to have had that transplant.
It's really a testament to show the difference that transplantation made, and for you to go from, not being able to hold food down to then having the freedom of eating, the things that people don't think anything of, like eating a banana or whatever, a chocolate bar. I'm not doing free advertisement here. Whatever chocolate bar that you would like to eat as well. Just having that choice, might seem really small to a lot of people, but actually is really significant and really shows the importance and strength of donation, and why we work so hard to raise awareness of kidney donation, because look at the difference it made in your life and the difference it makes in the lives of so many people out there.
Yeah, yeah. It gave me a life. It gave me my life back. It gave me a childhood that I was missing out on. It was amazing.
So you mentioned that sadly the kidney started failing at the age of 18. So tell me about what happened.
Yeah, so the kidney function had just started to decline around about the age of 18. I guess that we always sort of knew in the back of our head that transplants don't last forever. So wasn't completely surprised when it started happening. However, I was obviously terrified being an 18-year-old that I didn't know what I was facing. They had again tried to treat it with things like high dose steroids, infusions of, saline to hydrate the kidney. And that sort of worked for a good maybe year or so. That treatment, it kind of kept it at bay. But of course, I still wanted to go out with my friends and go clubbing and drink, not drinking too much, but drinks and just living a life. And by the time I was about 19, the kidney function had obviously started to decline much further, to the point that the discussion of a second transplant had come about. And at that time, my mum and my dad were both kind of next in line to go and look at donating a kidney. So it was my mum had went first, and over a sort of year's period, obviously she had all the tests and we were working up to that, and she was a match and it was all good. So we knew that by the time this kidney function had got to a certain stage, that we would quote unquote jump in there with a second transplant to sort of avoid dialysis. So that was the plan.
So your mum and dad started the process of living donation. So were your mum and dad a match? Were they able to donate to you?
Yeah, so my mum was the first one that went ahead with the testing. Everything was coming back absolutely fine. There was no issues, there was no antibodies, despite the fact that I'd obviously had a previous transplant and transfusion. So everything was looking good and looking like fantastic. We're going to avoid dialysis and get me a transplant. So the surgery was set for the 9th of April 2008. And, no concerns. Went in, all was good. The surgery, I think, went ahead on the 10th of April. And yeah, sort of no concerns allegedly during surgery. Kidney went in fine, pinked up, perfusion of blood, creating urine. Great, that's what we want. My mum was absolutely fine. But at some point during that night, I was not really with it. I just was sort of, well, out the game, for want of a better word. I don't really recall much of that night, which is quite odd for me. And I just remember being quite distressed and shouting for help, but falling back asleep again. And I remember the next morning, my brother and my dad had come to visit, and my brother went, this is quite funny, but it's also a bit sad as well. He said, "Oh my God, you look like the nutty professor. What's happened to you?" because apparently I was all swollen around here and everything was all swollen. I didn't realise this. So I was like, right, okay. So then what, I don't know if it's changed now, but usually once you have a transplant, they'll take you down that morning to get an ultrasound of the kidney just to check its perfusion and all of that sort of stuff, make sure everything's in the right place and doing as it should. So I just remember my surgeon coming up to my room and her colleague, both of them took me down to the ultrasound room, which back in the old Western in Glasgow was away down the basement. It was a very old Victorian hospital. And I was lying on the bed, still not very well. I was quite unwell. I was being sick quite a lot. And they were looking at the kidney with the ultrasounds. And I just remember them looking, the man that was doing the ultrasound, looking over and saying, I'm not seeing any blood perfusion to this kidney. I'm just lying there, sort of not entirely sure what I'm hearing. And he's like, you need to go and get the doctor, get the surgeon in here. So the surgeon came in, had a look. No, I'm not seeing anything. And I just seen the panic on their faces that, they didn't know what was going on here. So they wheeled me out of the room that they were doing the ultrasound, and they phoned my surgeon, and her colleague were standing beside me. And I just remember they phoned the porters to come and get me back to the ward to prep me for theatre. But they actually didn't wait. My surgeon and her colleague pushed me back themselves on the bed, straight back to the ward. I just remember, and it can be quite emotional because it was quite a traumatic, but I need to speak about it. I just remember a lot of people are in my room and in my bed taking blood gases, taking different bloods, sticking needles in me. I was being sick constantly. They brought my mum in to see me. My mum's obviously in a wheelchair, having just had a kidney removed. But they said they brought her in to see me. Fine. Got wheeled down to theatre. And I remember I was being sick so much that they had to hold my throat and put a mask on me and then just get me to sleep quickly, because they thought, right, we'll go in, we'll have a look and see what's happening with this kidney and we'll hopefully be able to rectify it. Came back from theatre. I don't know how long I was down there for. And I woke up and they told me that they had to remove the kidney, that the kidney was gone.
I cannot imagine how difficult and traumatic that was for you in that moment, going through so much at such a young age, and then hearing that news. I mean, for you and your family, what were you going through at that time to hear that news?
Do you know what? Initially, I couldn't quite comprehend it. I was sort of just a bit blasé about it, I think, because I was, on medication for pain, that I was just like, oh, right, okay, not really understanding exactly the scale of what had just happened. And it wasn't until maybe a day later that the penny dropped. I couldn't believe it. And my mum was just devastated. My mum was she was still recovering well, but she was just being there because we were on the same ward. So I was just spending lots of time with my mum. And it was like trying to come to terms with the fact of what has just happened. And oh my God, I'm going to end up back on dialysis again. This was not part of the plan. I lost so much weight. I'm quite a small person anyway, but I was down about 5.5 stone, and I had to ask for a Zimmer frame to walk because I was so ill after that. After the transplant going in and the transplant coming out, so ill. I remember I was sitting in the shower. They'd wheeled me into the shower and I was just sitting there in a wheelchair, and I just felt like dead inside. Like I just felt so dead. I didn't know how to move past that because I knew what was coming. And it was a horrendous time. That's an understatement, but it was horrendous and scary and unknown to some degree.
Were you given any support at all to come to terms with the loss of the kidney?
Not one bit of support, nothing at all. It was a case of, right, that's it, kidneys failed. Let's start talking about dialysis. Let's start planning to put a line in. That's it. There was nothing, and you've got to bear in mind I was 20 at this point, and there was no support, psychological support at all. I had just been through a massive trauma, and not only a massive trauma, I'd also been through the losing of my first transplant as well, which I think people don't talk about the grief related to transplant loss. There is a grieving process, and as you know, a lot of these times that doesn't happen overnight. It's a process, but there was nothing. There was no support at all. I was expected to just sort of, right, that's happened. Okay, you're back on dialysis now. Bye. That's how it happened, and there was nothing. I was not a well person.
To go through all of that trauma with no support is totally unacceptable. And, I hear time and time again, so many times when I'm interviewing people on the podcast, that there is this lack of support. And so I want to take this opportunity to speak to the people who are in charge of making these decisions and assigning resources for support. To those who are listening, to those who are watching today, who are making these decisions about us as kidney patients, what do you have to say to them in terms of what needs to be done, what needs to change, and why it's so important?
What they need to realise is that what is now starting to be well documented is the symptom burden and the treatment burden of dialysis and transplantation and graft loss. And that, especially when dialysis is involved, you're facing your own mortality constantly. You can't escape it. It's a disease that can continually re-traumatize you and continually make new traumas. And I don't think that being expected to, I think it was the Kidney Care UK had wrote the report about the Just Get On With It report, which, highlighted obviously the percentage of patients with anxiety and depression, with all sorts of other kind of psychological issues related to dialysis and transplant. They need to actually take that into consideration and put psychosocial care into the care plans of renal patients, not just the medication or the dialysis and all of that stuff. It's a holistic approach that they need to take, and they just are not taking it.
This is something I feel so strongly about, because I feel like while there's a focus on keeping us alive, whether that's through inserting a line or whatever emergency procedure is done to preserve life, but they forget that once we're kept alive, we need to not just survive, but live. We need to thrive. And so I really do believe that there needs to be a massive focus on psychological support and helping people, especially a young child, a young person. I think that as a young person, as a child, as a teenager, you have enough challenges when things are quote unquote normal without any kind of medical complications. The hormonal changes and everything that happens as a part of a typical childhood is tough enough.
Mm-hmm.
Add to that serious medical complications, it's even more difficult and traumatic. There really needs to be support throughout the journey of kidney disease, throughout the different stages and changes that you go through, whether that's transplantation or starting dialysis or getting the diagnosis in the first place. I really do believe and will always fight for more mental health support. And, for the people watching and listening, please do speak to your MP. Please do, sign the petitions. Please do use your voice to help to bring awareness to this issue, because we don't want to see people suffering. We want to see people thriving, not just surviving.
No, you're absolutely right. Yeah. And I think that's where I'm sort of coming at it from as well, is that despite me being older now, I think more focus on younger people with CKD, because like you've sort of pointed out, they're going through the natural maturation process that any kid, teenager goes through. But having the addition of kidney failure or dialysis on top of that, I mean, you're running into potential issues with identity crisis, depression, body dysmorphia, things that could be long lasting and have a huge detrimental effect. So actually they're needing to really address that at that side of it to avoid these children growing up and having much more damage psychologically than they have already been exposed to with their illness.
And that brings us to the end of part 1 of Johanna's story. In part 2, Johanna shares what happened next, returning to dialysis at just 20 years old, facing the devastating reality of transplant loss and the extraordinary transplant journey that followed. Part 2 is out now, so click the link in the description to continue watching Johanna's story. And if today's episode resonated with you, please share it to help raise awareness of the realities of living with kidney disease. Until next time, take care and choose to live.
Diary of a Kidney Warrior podcast in partnership with Kidney Care UK. Sharing faith, knowledge, hope, and love.